Good morning, everyone. So I have to admit that I think I probably conned everyone into letting me do this because anyone who has been on a road trip with me has had to hear me talk incessantly about how excited I am about the day when I do not have to drive and I do not have to worry about other humans driving. I am so excited for autonomous vehicles. So Alain, I wanted to start with you. You have been researching and studying in this field for a really long time. How do people respond differently when you talk about your work now than when you first started?
Well, yes, I have been doing this for a long time, and the whole vision of this has changed. Originally, we were going to have automated highways, and there were only going to be automated vehicles in an automated highway. But of course, that was a chicken and egg situation that couldn't possibly evolve, because who would build the highways when there are no automated cars, and who's going to build automated cars when there are no automated highways? And then about 12 or so years ago with the DARPA challenge, all of a sudden some people said, well, my goodness, maybe we can put enough intelligence in a vehicle so it can go out there with all of us and not crash. And I think that's the real change, because all of a sudden you wouldn't have to have all the infrastructure investment in the highways before you could do this. You could actually start with a single vehicle, get it to work, everybody embrace it, and then you basically replicate. And we know that Moore's law applies there, so the replication cost is small, and so you go to 2, then 4, then 8, and you have viral adoption. So that's really what has fueled all this interest, that, hey, maybe this is real and it could happen.
David, I'm wondering, I mean, this is a little bit, looking into the future, and we talked a little bit about how it seems like when we talk about autonomous vehicles and when they're going to be widely available or widely adopted, it seems like everything happens, I think you guys said, in 4-year spurts. It'll happen in 4 years, and then a year from now, it'll be another 4 years. What do you think, so let's talk about 5 years. 5 years from now, what do you think the market for or the availability of autonomous vehicles are? Where do you think we are?
Got it. Well, first I should let Alain opine on his saying. You were telling me this earlier about the 4 years. Do you want to share that?
Well, 4 years ago, Google said that they were going to do it in 4 years, and we still have 2 months to go. They haven't done it yet. And I like to say it's like thermonuclear fusion. We're going to have cheap, available energy 30 years from now. We've been saying that for the past 50 years. So, but because this is really tough. This is really tough, and so go ahead.
So I am perhaps more optimistic or just more naive than Alain. I really do think we'll have autonomous vehicles in much more widespread than we do today in the next 5 years. People ask me a lot about when we'll see self-driving cars, and I often say it's more about where than when. We already have autonomous vehicles in certain very select, tightly geofenced areas. So Pittsburgh, Uber's testing. Waymo is testing in a variety of cities in the US, Phoenix, San Francisco, Austin. A couple of companies are testing in Singapore. Other companies are testing in Germany and other places. And the question is, over the next 5 years, how quickly do those geofences expand? So right now, there are self-driving cars in very small areas of downtown urban cores. Part of that relates to the expense of mapping those areas really well. That's something that self-driving cars tend to need right now. So how quickly can we expand those areas? And then how quickly are the companies running the autonomous vehicles comfortable pulling the driver out of the seat? California just passed regulations, or the DMV just announced they're going to allow cars to actually operate without drivers on public roads. And Waymo just had a press day where they showed off on their own self-driving test track cars without drivers. And it'll be exciting to see those on real roads.
Yeah, so there's been some speculation that the way that we might see this happen first is actually with truck drivers and trucks on highways. Is that true? Do you guys agree with that? And what would make that potentially more feasible than seeing it, on the streets of Washington, D.C.? Alain?
Well, I think we better get our terminology right.
Yeah.
I look at driverless vehicles as being entities in which there's a human in the vehicle, and you can sometimes take your hands off the wheel and feet off the brake, but there's a human in the vehicle. That is an entirely different thing and business case than driverless when you have nobody in the vehicle or no driver, or in fact you don't want a driver in the vehicle. And it's a real difference. So in fact, what Uber is doing, what Waymo's doing, what everybody's doing, they always have a human in the vehicle. That is not driverless. Driverless is we're going to be all chauffeured around. That's a whole different business case. That's mobility for all. That's essentially mass transit. And so that's the one end of it, which I always think is sort of the utopian end of this thing. That's a real value proposition of why we're doing this. The driverless is, hey, comfort and convenience, man, I can take my hands, hell, I'll have a great time. I'm going to buy that. GM's going to sell that to me. Tesla's been selling that to me. Mercedes has been selling it, and they're going to sell that like I like to say, chrome and fins that they sold in car dealerships forever. The real beginning of this for safety, which is what everybody wants to talk about, is you don't have to take your hands off the wheel. You don't have to take your feet off the brake. What you need is all these systems to make you behave. That's our problem with safety. We misbehave for good or bad reasons. So what we need is to envelop ourselves with the technology that every time we misbehave, it's like a child in a grocery cart in the grocery store. They have a little steering wheel, and the kid can do anything they want. They can do donuts on their neighbor's lawn, but the mother is behind that, making sure that kid's safe. So in a sense, all this technology that we're talking about eventually doing driverless can come out today, and is starting to come out today, although it really doesn't work, sort of works, to be able to make us safe. And that's available, or should be available now, and that's what NHTSA and DOT should be pushing. Hey, the car dealers will sell you the driverless. They'll make a ton of money off that sucker, and then at some point somebody's going to take a leap of faith and say, we're going to put it out there without a driver, and we're going to do the mobility. And Jeff Bezos may realize that, in fact, he can deliver goods to your homes in the middle of the night when there's nobody else using the roads with these things, and he'll build the technology and make it happen.
I think the delivery is, so that's a really interesting angle to this, and your question about highways is really interesting, because essentially you have a few very large fixed costs. So you have the cost of mapping, and you have the cost of the vehicle. Particularly the sensor suite that goes on self-driving cars right now is very, very expensive. And so if you're thinking about where are we going to see self-driving cars first, we're probably going to see them in areas where there is really high vehicle usage so that we can amortize that fixed cost over a lot of miles. And so the areas where we'll see that are downtown urban cores, where there are lots and lots of people who want rides at all hours of the day over a fairly small area that's easier to map. And then on highways, which are very structured environments where you have logistics companies, freight companies, traveling again kind of 24 hours a day. And both of those areas provide kind of similar economic benefits for self-driving vehicles. Yeah.
So you think this is going to happen on kind of the mass transit end of the spectrum?
It seems likely, at least at first, that that self-driving cars will be for ride-sharing services, for freight delivery services, the types of services that can utilize the self-driving technology 24/7, so that the cost of the vehicle is economical.
Right. So I want to go back to something that Alan said, the difference between a vehicle where you have the driver there, but either it's being made sure that they can't do anything that's unsafe, or they can kind of take a break. It might, help truck drivers who are doing long hauls, prevent some of the issues with fatigue and some of the other concerns. I want to talk about the leap from that to truly driverless vehicles. And one of the things that I hear a lot of concern about is the fact that that will put, obviously, a lot of people who are drivers professionally out of business. But at the same time, it stands to reason that there would be a bunch of job creation elsewhere to help perfect these technologies to kind of be more innovative in this space. So I want you guys to talk a little bit about how you see the intersection of the labor market and kind of this drive to actual driverless cars.
Well, if you do the distinction that I like to point out, that there's a real difference between self-driving and driverless. Then on the self-driving, where there's a human that's involved, then the Teamsters and the labor unions should be all for that, because what does that do, as you've pointed out, that improves the workplace of what is probably one of the toughest jobs that exists. I mean, just think, a truck driver has to pay attention and not go out of his or her lane and not hit anything in front of them for like 10 hours every day to feed their families. That is tough. I can't concentrate like that. You mess up, you die. So they really need the technology to allow them to relax. Hey, improve their work environment. You know, not do the things that they do so that they're like this all day long. And that's why the Teamsters and every owner of a trucking company and every owner of a fleet should be wanting this technology, not to replace the driver, to make it much more attractive for their own employees to do the job that they do. Maybe we'll give them a few extra hours of service and so on, as a, you know, to actually help, but that certainly would improve it. In fact, there's a shortage of drivers. It might make driving so attractive so that there's no longer a shortage. People might want to do it instead of being beat over the head to do it. That's the driverless world. When we take that person out of the truck, I mean, that's a self-driving world. When we take that person out of the truck, that's a whole different ball game, okay? You have a Class 8 vehicle with lots of value and behind you, you can almost afford to have somebody as a caretaker up there to take care of that. So very few of those jobs are really going to be lost. In fact, if they're not driving, you know, they might be, you know, telemarketing, customer service as the rest of the world is going by them. So in fact, this is not about unemploying drivers. And as you say, if we really get to the driverless with respect to us, who are we unemploying? We're unemploying ourselves. Right now, many of you must have come here and you drove. You know, that's work. Who would we be unemploying if it becomes driverless is us. We free ourselves. It's almost liberation. Oh my goodness, it's like Downton Abbey. I'm going to be chauffeured around, da-da-dee-da-da-da-da-da-da. You know, it's a great thing.
Yeah, so I am very excited for our driverless future to be chauffeured around like Downton Abbey. I think realistically in the U.S. we have about 3 million people who drive for a living. And I think they're going to see their work environment change. We've already seen that with ride-sharing services and taxi companies. And I think what we're going to see is people are going to have different careers as their lives progresses, and we as a society are going to have to be in a position to help people who maybe see the career that they were in at one point change or go away and need to transition to another career. So the company I work at, Udacity, I teach a self-driving car program at Udacity. We do lifelong education. Our average student, or our modal, most common student, is out of college and is moving from one career path to another. I went to Princeton, where Alain teaches. It's a little bit difficult right now to go back to Princeton when you're 40 years old if your career changes. It happens, but it's fairly rare. I think we're going to see our educational institutions probably change to accommodate these types of changes in the workforce.
Yeah. So I have another question or two for our panel, but then we want to open up to the audience. So I would say do start thinking about your questions now and condensing them down and making sure that they're questions also. So one of the things that we've mentioned earlier in this conversation is that, you know, right now you have automakers who would sell you a, you know, autonomous vehicle. It's a moneymaker for them. You mentioned Tesla. I think one of the things that I hear a lot as a concern is that this technology will become kind of a plaything of the wealthy, and it won't be something that will ultimately help, you know, regular people who need to get around, you know, their cities. So I'm wondering how you guys are thinking about that and kind of how the technology is being used to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something we actually are already kind of seeing play out, and we're seeing it move down market to society. So, autopilot was released on Teslas. Teslas are very expensive vehicles. You might say they're for the wealthy or at least the affluent. But now we're seeing those types of features, lane keeping assistance, adaptive cruise control, move down market to the type of mass market cars that most Americans and people around the world drive. And that's a pretty standard technological curve that some technology starts up market and is only accessible to the wealthy, and then it kind of moves down market, and I imagine we'll see similar types of things happen with autonomous vehicles.
Well, where I see it is that the technology, again, should move all the way down to the safe driving car concept. The concept such that it's in all of our vehicles, that it's there, that keeps us from misbehaving when we're driving and keeps us from crashing and keeps us from going out of the lane. And that's of value to all the people that drive now. On the other end, in the driverless, that provides mobility for everybody, because I don't think I'm going to own a driverless vehicle. Why would I? I mean, owning a vehicle is a pain in the butt. I mean, you got to wash it, you got to insure it, you got to you have to worry about scratching it. You know, at Downton Abbey, we get picked up, we get chauffeured on demand. We will have to share rides. We will have to go with people, because if we don't, then it's going to be a real mess out there. Okay, but if we do, then all of a sudden we solve congestion, we solve the environment, we reduce energy, and it becomes dirt cheap. So in a sense, you know, over here on the driverless end is really that utopian that provides mobility for everybody. That levels the playing field for everybody. It's not this middle ground of self-driving, which is really a toy for the rich.
Yeah, I mean, I think to Alan's point, the driverless future really is something that will benefit perhaps people down the economic spectrum, simply because, you know, as we see right now, housing in urban cores is very, very expensive, and we're kind of seeing an inversion of the way people, of demography, of the way people used to live. It's become more expensive to live in urban cores and relatively cheaper to live outside. And then folks who maybe aren't as economically well off spend a lot of time commuting to work. And as we see driverless technology take off, that will enable people who live outside of urban cores to have a less costly journey to work, regardless of exactly where they are on the economic spectrum, but hopefully it'll benefit a wide variety of people.
But when we're at the driverless world, then in fact our zoning laws can change and not require parking in all the buildings. And somebody who's going to build a building, like when Apple built their spaceship, there's what, 11,000 parking spaces. What if they would have taken that and amortized the amount of money that they put there as then a fund that they then spend to provide chauffeur, driverless mobility to everybody? Oh my goodness, this is a completely different. And it then implies that a medium density sort of development environment is really kind of the sweet spot, as opposed to having us all move out even farther from where we are now, so that we can now just take our hands off our wheels and feet off our brakes in the vehicle that we own that sort of provides that. So
you've both mentioned ride sharing as kind of one of the key uses of this technology. So when we think 5-6 years in the future, do the Ubers and Lyfts of the world have a major advantage over Waymo, over existing auto companies?
I think they have a terrific advantage, but not necessarily a decisive advantage. We see a lot of companies that we have traditionally thought of as either technology companies or automotive manufacturing companies that are trying to figure out how to become mobility companies. And so Uber and Lyft have a head start because they have a network, they have an understanding of how to deploy ride sharing. On the other hand, they have some difficulties. They have drivers who may not necessarily want to be in competition with autonomous vehicles. And so I think everybody kind of has their own issues to work through, and it'll be interesting to see who winds up where. I'm not sure it's totally obvious who will win that market yet.
In the United States, Uber and Lyft don't scale unless they do driverless. You can't hire enough of those kind of workers to get beyond less than 1% of the trips that you serve. However, the concept with respect to driverless is that you're not serving 1% of the trips, of the typical billion trips that take place on a typical day in the United States, the billion vehicle trips. You do 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of those guys. You can't scale. There aren't that many gig workers available to do that. They have to have driverless to do it. What they bring to the game is they have some experience in ride sharing. You can replicate that in like 3 minutes. You can redo their app in 4 minutes, or maybe a little longer than that, but whatever. You know, sure. No, but so the fleet operator that's going to do this, that's going to basically monetize this thing, to be able to then do the matching and the optimization and the vehicle repositioning, and oh yes, we'll use electric vehicles and we'll recharge them properly, and we won't have the range anxiety and the recharge anxiety associated with those things and so on. Geez, that's all trivial to do in this thing. What's much harder is make sure they don't crash ever.
I got a question for you, actually, Alan.
No, that's not
I got one for you. Electric vehicles. So
yes.
You mentioned recharging. Do you see electric vehicles as being a really important part of this equation, or not really? Are they not realistic?
Well, I see this as a fleet decision as opposed to an individual decision today. So, you know, at the individual today, the reason they don't buy electric vehicles is because of the range anxiety and recharge anxiety. I mean, it's going to take me a half hour to recharge it, and oh my goodness, I can only go 3 miles or whatever it is in people's minds. It has nothing to do with reality. Whereas if I'm a fleet operator, I have data. I know exactly. I know the trips I'm going to serve. I know how far they have to go. I can put that in an optimization algorithm. I can recharge them. I've got my fleet so it hits the peak. There's a bunch of off-peak when I can be recharging. I go out and then make a business decision on the return on investment. And guess what? Electric looks a whole heck of a lot better than everything else, probably. Yeah. And so that's why it evolves that way, because it ends up being a real business fleet decision, an operation decision, as opposed to each of us individuals making whatever decisions we make.
All right, I think we want to get a few audience questions in if we can.
Yeah, John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. On the low end, you have cars that have automatic braking. The high end, the fully self-driving, driverless. In the middle, you have a car that sort of drives itself, but expects the driver to be able to take over at any moment. But the human driver has no situational awareness because they've been, playing on their iPhone while the car is driving itself. Do you see that sort of mid-range, that it's not really fully self-driving, as being inherently flawed?
I think it's an interesting race right now that you see between a company like Tesla that is taking that kind of mid-range approach. They're essentially layering on more and more advanced driver assistance systems with presumably the aspiration of getting to a fully autonomous vehicle. And then companies like Waymo and Ford have been very public about how in their testing they found test drivers going to sleep and not being able to respond to the need to take over the wheel quickly enough. And they're kind of taking the approach of jumping straight to autonomous vehicles. And they're both of those approaches are kind of racing to see who can get to fully autonomous first. I don't think anybody, it doesn't seem like anybody really wants to stop in this middle level. It's more like, is this a way station on the way to getting to fully autonomous vehicles? But I mean, to your question, it certainly seems like from reports we've seen that there are problems in reaction times of humans taking over the wheel for cars. Tesla, Elon Musk are smart people, and I imagine they're thinking about this a lot, but the reports we've seen are troubling.
All right, do we have time for one more?
The answer is yes, and I think just to throw in, GM's done a really good thing with the CT6. They put a camera in there to watch your eyes, and so if you all of a sudden start dozing off, it pulls over the sides and said, you can't use this. Okay, so if you start misbehaving, they whack you.
I think we're going to try and get one more.
Hi, Justin Park. I had a technical question that leads into a legal question. How much data is collected with the point cloud? Are you able to store 24 hours of information, and could that be used to figure out what happens, who's liable when two of these self-driving cars collide?
All right, does one of you want to take that?
Well, the answer is yes, of course. The data is going to be there, and and I guess the proof is the proof. And so you're going to have that. Part of the issue is how much of the data are you going to collect. As I like to tell my students, one of the good things our minds do is that we forget. We get a lot of data into our bodies every nanosecond, and some of it we just blow off. And a lot of the things that will happen with these things, we should just be blowing off the data because it's boring. There are some really good things that we should be saving, and those things will be saved, and some lawyers will be out of jobs.
All right. Alan, Dave, thank you so much.